Every empire tells itself the same story, that its credit is limitless, that tomorrow's tax revenue will cover today's promises, that interest is a small price for greatness. But compound interest is the most patient predator in history. It never sleeps, never negotiates, and never forgets. Armies can be defeated and rebuilt, cities can burn and rise again, but when an empire's debt compounds faster than its growth, the collapse has already begun. It just hasn't been recognized yet. From the marble halls of 18th century France to the trading floors of post-war London, from Tokyo's glittering boom of the 1980s to the spreadsheet empires of modern Washington, the same sequence repeats. Borrow, spend, promise, borrow, again. Each generation convinced that debt is a tool, never a trap, until the interest consumes the empire itself. This is not a story about finance. It's a story about belief. How societies convince themselves that mathematics can be bargained with, and how, every time, that belief ends the same way. Debt is not evil. It begins as convenience, a bridge between need and capacity. A merchant borrows to expand trade. A kingdom borrows to fight a war. A government borrows to fund progress. At first, it works. Borrowing pulls the future into the present. Roads are built. Armies paid. Prosperity appears. But interest compounds quietly in the background. 5% seems harmless until it doubles a balance in 14 years. 10% halves an empire's time. Politicians discover the secret every debtor loves. The pain of borrowing is invisible. The pleasure of spending is immediate. So they borrow again and again. Soon the economy adjusts to the borrowed money as if it were real growth. Tax receipts rise because the debt-fueled spending lifts everything. Creditors praise stability. Bond markets cheer. Then one day, interest payments exceed the cost of defense. Then they exceed education. Then infrastructure. Eventually, debt becomes not a means to prosperity, but the largest expense on the national ledger. That is the debt spiral, a self-sustaining loop where the solution to yesterday's borrowing is always more borrowing tomorrow, and it has claimed every modern empire in turn. In the 1780s, France was the richest, most sophisticated nation in Europe, but also the most indebted. A century of war against Britain had emptied the treasury. Louis XIV's palaces glittered. Louis XV's conquests drained the coffers. And by the time Louis XVI ascended the throne, interest payments consumed over half of France's revenue. The state could not pay its bills without new loans, but the loans required confidence, and confidence required reform. Reform, however, threatened privilege. The nobility and clergy paid almost no tax. The burden fell on the peasantry, already squeezed by harvest failures and inflation. Finance Minister Necker introduced perpetual bonds, a promise that France could borrow forever without repaying principal. Investors believed him. At first, Parisian salons buzzed with talk of modern finance, of an enlightened monarchy harnessing credit like Britain. But credit is belief, and belief has limits. By 1788, lenders refused to roll the debt. The government was paying interest with borrowed interest. When confidence snapped, it snapped overnight. Bread prices doubled. Riots spread. The Crown called the Estates General for the first time in 175 years. Within 12 months, the monarchy itself was gone. The revolution began not with ideology, but insolvency. France learned the first rule of the spiral. You can postpone bankruptcy, but not mathematics. A century later, Britain ruled a quarter of the planet. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency, the benchmark of trust. But empires are expensive, and global wars cost more than glory can repay. World War I. In 1914, Britain's national debt was £650 million. By 1919, it was £7 billion, 10 times larger. For the first time in 2 centuries, Britain owed more abroad than it owned. The gold standard broke under the strain. To fund the war, the government suspended convertibility and printed credit. Inflation followed. After the armistice, Britain tried to return to the pre-war gold rate, an act of national pride, not arithmetic. The pound was overvalued, exports collapsed, unemployment soared. It was the illusion of solvency, maintaining a proud exchange rate while bleeding internally. World War II. Then came 1939. By 1945, debt reached 250% of GDP, the highest in British history. Whole cities lay in ruins. The empire that had financed others was now borrowing from the United States under the Lend-Lease Act. After the victory parades, the bills arrived. Interest payments devoured the peace dividend. To manage, Britain nationalized industries, rationed goods, and quietly devalued the pound. 1949, sterling cut by 30%. 1967, another 14%. Each devaluation bought time, but eroded trust. By 1976, the country that had once funded the world went begging to the IMF. It was more than an economic event. It was imperial humiliation. The debt spiral had done what no invasion could. It made the empire dependent. Britain discovered the second rule of the spiral. Debt does not destroy empires in a storm. It erodes them tide by tide. If Britain's decline was imperial, Japan's was industrial. In the 1980s, Japan was the envy of the world, a technological miracle, the Japan Incorporated model of state-guided capitalism. Land in Tokyo's Ginza district was worth more per square meter than all of California. The Nikkei index tripled in 5 years. But behind the euphoria was leverage. Banks lent freely against rising asset prices. Companies borrowed to buy each other's shares. Debt financed illusion, not productivity. When the bubble burst in 1990, property values fell 80%. The government intervened, guaranteeing bad loans, bailing out banks, launching public works programs. It worked temporarily, because printing and borrowing always do. But the private debt simply migrated onto the public balance sheet. By 2000, Japan's government debt exceeded 150% of GDP. By 2010, 200%. By 2020, 260%, the highest in the developed world. Interest rates fell to zero, then below zero, trapping the country in perpetual stagnation. An entire generation grew up without wage growth, without inflation, without momentum. Japan's problem was not collapse, but paralysis. The debt spiral can freeze as well as explode. An economy can appear calm because the pressure valve, growth, has broken. Lesson 3. When debt cannot be repaid, it must be rolled forever, and permanence becomes decay. In 1944, at Bretton Woods, the world anchored its financial future to the U.S. dollar, the only currency still backed by gold and industrial might. For a generation, it worked. America produced half of global GDP, held 2/3 of the world's gold, and financed Europe's recovery. The dollar became as good as gold, because it was gold. But in 1971, the foundation cracked. Facing deficits from Vietnam and the Great Society, President Nixon suspended gold convertibility. The dollar became fiat, money backed not by metal, but by confidence. Stage 1 of the modern spiral had begun. In 1980, national debt stood at $900 billion. By 2000, $5.6 trillion. By 2010, $13 trillion. By 2020, $27 trillion. By 2025, over $36 trillion. Interest payments now rival the entire defense budget, hundreds of billions each year just to service yesterday's spending. Every fiscal debate ends the same way. Tax increases are political suicide. Spending cuts are economic suicide. So the answer, always, is more debt. The bond market becomes the new battlefield. Instead of armies, auctions. Instead of conquests, deficits. And for decades, it appeared sustainable because growth, globalization, and technology masked the cost. But mathematics remains patient. When interest rates rise even modestly, compounding accelerates. A 1% increase on $36 trillion is $360 billion a year, a number larger than the budgets of most nations. Yet the real danger is psychological. The more debt becomes normal, the less anyone remembers life without it. Entire industries, pensions, and political careers depend on perpetual borrowing. The United States has not yet reached crisis, but it exhibits every early symptom: interest dominating the budget, debt ceilings rising annually, and the quiet assumption that tomorrow will always pay for today. Fourth rule of the spiral: the longer prosperity depends on borrowing, the less anyone can imagine prosperity without it. No ideology, no revolution, no policy has ever repealed this law. If debt grows faster than income, default is only a matter of form. At 5% interest, debt doubles every 14 years. At 7%, every decade. An empire can delay reckoning by lowering rates or printing money, but these are surface maneuvers. The arithmetic underneath continues its silent march. History's tragedy is that collapse always looks impossible a year before it happens, and inevitable a year after. Here are the 3 lessons we can learn from the spiral. Lesson 1. Debt buys peace today by stealing stability tomorrow. France postponed reform to preserve privilege, believing credit infinite. Britain financed wars and welfare with the same borrowed pound. Japan replaced recession with stagnation. Each purchased time and paid with growth. Lesson 2. You cannot compound forever in a finite world. Economic growth is linear, constrained by productivity and population. Interest is exponential. Eventually, the curve of obligation overtakes the curve of capacity. That intersection is where history resets. Lesson 3. When faith in repayment dies, the currency follows. Money is memory. It records trust between citizens and the state. When the state borrows beyond what citizens believe it can repay, that memory fades. First comes inflation, then substitution, foreign currencies, commodities, barter. Confidence leaves quietly, then all at once. The debt spiral is not a single event. It is a civilization's amnesia, forgetting that numbers are not opinions. Stand in any modern city at night. The towers glow with the light of borrowed money. Mortgages, bonds, student loans, sovereign debt. Every beam powered by promises written in tomorrow's ink. It feels permanent. So did Versailles. So did London in 1913. So did Tokyo in 1989. But history keeps a ledger, and on that ledger, every borrowed dollar is written twice, once as prosperity, once as a claim on the future. When the future refuses payment, the illusion ends, not with thunder, but with arithmetic. Because debt has no ideology, no mercy, and no forgiveness clause. It only has interest, and interest always collects. If this gave you a clearer view of how empires decay from the inside, subscribe. Because the next chapters of financial history are already being written, and when the spiral tightens again, you'll want to recognize the sound of its turning.